Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to talk about markets and how quantity demanded and quantity supplied can be impacted. In a competitive market, there are two drives, and those are going to be demand and supply. With each sides of this, there are going to be a few determinants that are going to affect the outcome. And two common factors are price expectation and taxes and subsidies. These are going to affect both supply and demand. Now, an important thing to keep in mind is that while price is the main factor of quantity supplied and quantity demanded, there are going to be other factors that are going to affect both sides. Both demand and supply will promote the market to reach equilibrium. And at equilibrium, the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied will be equal with one another at the market clearing price. In a competitive market, shortage or surplus can happen in the short run, but in the long run, we will work towards hitting that equilibrium. Don't worry if you're not super familiar with what equilibrium means right now. That's something that we'll cover in more detail later on. When we look at quantity supplied and quantity demanded, we're thinking of this from a business or from an economic standpoint. So obviously, price is going to be a big driving factor for either side. As a consumer, the quantity that you're demanding is going to be very consistent with what that is happening with that price. As that price goes up, maybe you're demanding less of that product because you're not able to afford it anymore. Or as that product goes on sale and price goes down, you're going to want that product more because you are then able to afford it. Now, when we look from the supplier standpoint, price is important as well. If the price that customers are willing to pay is going up, I'm going to want to supply more of that product because I'm going to want to sell it and make money. Whereas if the price that my consumers are willing to pay is going down, maybe it's less worth it for me to supply a greater quantity of these goods because there's already quite a bit of a surplus and I'm not going to make a lot of money off of it. Now, as I said before, there are other factors that do affect the quantity demanded. Those are things like income, so what you're personally making, the price of related goods, if there are substitutes out there that I can go after, my personal tastes and preferences, the number of people I'm competing with to buy this particular product, what I think that price should be, and then any specific taxes and subsidies, which we'll get into a little bit later. On that supply side, inputs are going to be another determinant of how much I'm going to supply. How much work is it taking me to produce this project? What technology is necessary? And how that overall process is going to cost me and impact my ability to produce. If there's a lot of other people selling that product, I'm not going to be as interested in trying to supply that as well. And then again, those taxes and subsidies. Now, important things to take away from this slide. We have a shortage if the quantity that's demanded is greater than that quantity supplied. So when you see QD, that's quantity demanded, and QS is going to be quantity supplied. And then we have a surplus whenever that quantity supplied, or QS, is greater than that quantity demanded. Something that you want to think about, what factors are going to affect the price of gasoline? Now, we know that gasoline isn't a very competitive market because there are tons and tons of suppliers out there. So there's not really a ton of fluctuation in prices. But the conclusions that we can draw from our supply and demand model that we're going to take a look at are still relevant. We know that the price of gasoline will often adjust, and it's one of the most visible prices to consumers every day because we're frequently going out and putting gas in our vehicles. This is why it's kind of a good idea to start with this example because it's something that you can probably relate to. So what do we think affects the price of gasoline? Some people will say demand. So the demand meaning, are people wanting to buy gasoline? Is it a good travel time? Are a lot of people going on vacation? Are we getting back into that school year where more people are taking their children to school? These are all things that might affect gasoline prices. The cost of production, what it's going to cost these various gas stations to actually acquire that product. And then the competition. Is this a very rural area where there's only one gas station, or is this a city where there's a gas station on every block? Now, one thing that you may or not be aware of is excise taxes on gasoline. And this is something that we'll get into a little bit later in the chapter as well. But this just means that some states have specific taxes that are directly related to gasoline. And that's why the price of gasoline varies from state to state. So we'll talk about this a little bit later as a cost to the seller, because that's going to be something they do have to factor in when they're considering if they're going to sell gasoline and how much they're going to charge for that. But the major point that I want to get across here is you need to think about factors that affect both buyers and sellers when coming up with what's going to affect the price of gasoline. So let's get into some of the fundamentals of markets. First up, we have to think that there are always two parties, at least, to every transaction. We have our firms and our consumers. So you're probably very familiar with the demand side of the market because as a consumer, you're constantly purchasing things and interacting with that. But we want to think of it from the supply side as well. So your firms are going to supply those goods or services, and your consumers are going to purchase those goods that are supplied by firms. The way that these exchanges happen are because we have prices that are established in the market, and then supplier demand factors will affect that overall market price. When we talk about markets, markets are going to exist anywhere that goods and services are exchanged. So this is going to be any place where buyers and sellers meet up, and it doesn't have to be necessarily a physical place. So we have stores. That's a pretty common market. You can think Walmart, Target, things like that. You go in as a consumer and the producers or suppliers have their goods in that store, and you're able to purchase those goods and take them home with you. That's a market. Flea markets or yard sales. Again, this is a physical place. You go, you exchange for goods and services, and you're able to meet up with those suppliers. Now, less common examples that come to mind when we think of a market itself are going to be online stores. So we have things like Amazon, we have bidding websites like eBay, and this can also be things like classifieds, which aren't used as much anymore, but those can be in newspapers or on Craigslist. And then there can also be things like Facebook Marketplace, where you're not necessarily physically going into a store, but you're still able to be connected with those suppliers to find and locate those goods and services that you desire. Now, some fundamentals of markets. We're going to first take a look at the market economy. Keep in mind that resources are allocated among households and firms with little or no government interference. And producers and consumers are going to be motivated by self-interest. That's very important to keep in mind in economics. We're always going to be motivated by that self-interest. A very common phrase you hear in economics is talking about the invisible hand. And this just means that the market naturally is going to kind of correct to get us to that equilibrium area. So no party has any particular intention to promote market efficiency, but the selfness will eventually push that market to reach the best outcome. There's a really good quote from Adam Smith that says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interests." So what that's saying is that your butcher, the coffee baristas, the baker, these people don't produce these goods just from the kindness of their own heart. They're interested in making money. And because they're interested in making money, we know that we can go out and buy those goods that we need and that they're going to be available for us. So next up, we want to take a look at competitive markets. In a competitive market, you have a lot of buyers and sellers, and what those sellers are setting up are very similar. No one individual has any influence over price for a couple of different reasons. So a fish market is a pretty good example, or a produce market. There are typically hundreds of buyers and sellers, and that product that's being sold is pretty much more or less the same amongst all of these sellers. One green apple is going to be the same as the next. We can't really tell which orchard grew it, and one particular farmer can't control the price, but instead they have to take that price or the market price as it's given. So they don't really have a lot of influence. If they were to change their prices by quite a bit, it's not really going to work out because nobody's going to buy from them. Now, imperfect markets do exist, and this is one that just doesn't meet those conditions that I was just telling you about. There may be one particular buyer or seller that has influence over the price, and the market power means that there is one firm that has an ability to influence price. And that's pretty common in instances where monopoly occurs, and that just means that one single company is supplying the entire market for a particular good or services. So this means that there may be few sellers or buyers available, or it's a product that's heterogeneous across sellers, meaning that each seller's product can be distinguished and some are going to be better than others. Now, in either of these cases, the seller does have an ability to influence the price of the good. And some examples would be things like fast food hamburgers. While there are maybe a lot of different sellers and buyers, each particular restaurant is able to kind of distinguish their product and use advertising to kind of impact that market price. Airlines, when you look at things like Spirit being on the very bottom end of that spectrum, where they're offering very low undercut prices, but also very low undercut service, versus like your Southwest, American Airlines, the others that are a little bit pricier, but each particular airline is able to distinguish their service from the others. Cars, you can go out and you can buy kind of the base model, the cheapest of the cheap, or there is that kind of market for those luxury, very expensive cars. And at the extreme, which is not something that occurs often, there's going to be only one firm producing a product and no real substitutes available. And that's going to be when monopoly occurs. In the 1980s, there was a firm called De Beers, and they basically held about 90% of the rough diamond market. Now it's down below 30%. But in that case, they really had carte blanche on controlling what the prices of those diamonds were because they didn't really have any distinct competitors. So something that it's very important for you to understand, we're going to assume in economics competitive markets when we talk about supply and demand. The conclusions tell us a lot about what happens in imperfectly competitive markets as well. But our main concern is going to be with competitive markets because that is going to be the more common occurrence. Now, this is where I'm going to go ahead and stop this video, but you can head back over to Blackboard to check out the video on demand. Thank you guys, and I'll talk with you in the next one.